We have a lot of ground to cover today. Number one, based on the subscriber question. Number two, based on the requirements. As we make the case for the WRX80 Workstation Threadripper Pro Thunderbolt 3 support motherboard. Let's go to the question. Bear with me, it's going to take a little while to read through that as we go through the information, and you'll see the 1, 2, 3 as we look at the problem, the solution, and the best way to resolve this. We're going to have three options. Only one right now is probably going to be realistic, but I want to go through all of it so we kind of have a big picture because there's some stuff that's just been announced that is relevant to this. The question. This question is in response to the ASUS ProArt Z490 Creator 10G Thunderbolt 3 motherboard and a by 16 M.2 NVMe quad card, and very appropriate considering what we're working with and the requirements we're going to have. It'll all be apparent. And this comment is from OC Can You See? I'm hoping for a new build in the fall of 2022. Purpose: audio recording with PreSonus Studio One and video editing with Magix Vegas Pro. I don't have an open-ended budget, but this will not be a cheap build because I need it to work efficiently for many years to come. Question: should I decide on a motherboard first before selecting a CPU? I'm heavily leaning towards AMD. The more dedicated PCI Express lanes, the better. Thank you, Rob. Well, that in itself is alone as we outline this, but we still got more to do that's going to help us as we go 1, 2, 3 down the list based on his criteria. My first response. Hi OC, can you see? Welcome, excellent. This really needs a video response, which is what we're doing. Until then, doing due diligence now to avoid those coulda, shoulda, woulda, gotchas later. PreSonus Studio One for audio and Magix Vegas Pro for video. Both are smart choices. Knowing the difference about PCI Express lane resources allocations also helps immensely in your favor. Yes, you need more PCI Express lanes. 2 years ago, we would have said the TRX40. As we like to outline with this machine, which is the Gigabyte TRX40 designator high-end desktop. Looks like it's going to be one generation, but this was a great item, even if this still had a second generation processor coming out, which I'm going to address some more in a bit. I still think where we're headed for what you want is going to be above this, which is where we're getting to. It's going to take time to digest all that because I've got a lot of information to share. Okay, there are two ways to go with this. One, we can talk about CPU core count, or two, we can talk about PCI Express lanes, or even add Thunderbolt to the mix, and that alone can change our choices, which it will. AMD is definitely the better value. Intel overly complicates everything, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And considering the longevity of your build, an 18-month to 2 years or an 8 to 10-year build. It's either or. Your time frame for fall of 2022 is spot on, and it's ironic, when I did this, I made this comment a few days ago, but I've got some more information that occurred as of May the 1st, which now we're talking May the 3rd, which is even more relevant to what we're speaking of for the time frame going forward 6 months. Okay, PCI Express 4 is solid. Avoid PCI Express 5. I'll address that some more in a little bit. I've already been slammed about PCI Express 5, but I'll tell you more about it in a minute. My thoughts. And since PCI Express 6 is following close behind, that's why I don't think it's worth troubling ourselves with PCI Express 5. However, I'll come back and give you my thoughts. Now then, for video editing, even though you're going to use Magix Vegas Pro, let's start with the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. Because one, we can build toward a DAW, which this is going to be a little bit more of a DAW towards someone using a DAW for Thunderbolt, which we'll get to in the rest of your question. But I want to address right now at this point that as we build a purpose-built machine, we want to build a balanced machine. And if we direct it only toward the DAW, then we will not be as effective to build a machine for video editing. And that's what we're addressing with this right now, are the specs that we need to address. Even though it's a different video editor, we have the perfect formula that tells us these requirements to make this work for what you want to do. To reiterate, let's start with the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula. Number one, CPU cores times 4 equals RAM. Okay, in your next comment, we're going to have how much RAM you've got, and that will tell us how many cores we need, and it's a starting point. Number two, same thing. CPU core count equals video RAM. So the video card that you're going to mention in the rest of this comment, I'm going to counter with another offer that I think will be more in line with this, keeping with this spec. Okay, even though you're using Magix Vegas Pro, this is an easy spec to understand and great for guidance. Vegas Pro can use a GPU for 80% of rendering, which is amazing. And we need the video, which is what we're doing now, for the if I were building for what you're asking, here's what I would use. The what, why, and how. And that phrase I coined from Joe Winery, my co-host. God bless the man, God rest his soul. He was great. Retired from AMD, so I kind of had a little bit of an insight there with what AMD was going and doing for many, many years. Back to the question. OC Can You See? BuildOrBuy. Gil, thank you for your YouTube channel. Thank you. I've learned a lot. Great. Other than what I have stated in the original post, here are my needs. As many internal M.2 NVMe drives as possible for various purposes, including storage of large software instrument libraries. And on that note, my first thought goes to contact libraries for native instruments. That's where you want fast processing, where those instruments load quickly. Thunderbolt availability for universal audio Apollo connection. Okay. 64 gigs of RAM. Okay. NVIDIA GPU to handle as much processing as possible. I agree. If I were buying today, I would lean toward the RTX 3070. And I'm going to make a recommendation based on the formula that I gave that we'll get to it. Be different. We'll see what the October-December offerings are for all these issues. And I agree, because we always talk about list 5 things, prioritize those 5 things, but if you change that list, you change the order, change one thing, changes everything. Right now, based on what we're doing, based on this time frame, we need to reevaluate this when you are ready to build, because something could change. And that's what I want to get into, is about our options for this, because I think this is exciting and absolutely fascinating. 3 4K monitors, easy. A CPU with a maximum of 24 cores, and that is as we address the audio, but sufficient and suffice to say, we can address that and balance that for a purpose built for doing video as well. Okay, but careful balancing with a high base clock speed. Got it. USB ports aplenty, you'll have it. I'm willing to go with an EATX motherboard. Yep, well that's probably a given. No need for gaming, overclocking, RGB, or Wi-Fi. I agree. My guess, it's best to start with a motherboard search, but that's the purpose of this post. Finally, my current PC is over 9 years old and struggles mightily with video. Yep, I can hear what you're saying, and I understand that. I know technology is flying fast, but hoping to get 8+ years out of the next one. Thanks again, Rob. And my response, the next video or 2 will be of interest in knowing your options, which was the previous video we just did, this video, and the next video coming up. Because the next video coming up, we're going to address some of the issues with instruments as it relates to virtual instruments, but we're going to look at it on an X299 chipset based on another question, which I think is going to be stunning and fascinating. Because, again, change one thing, changes everything. Your question and another one need to be addressed in succession. And for those of you that have been watching the videos that we've been doing, I'm getting to the questions as quick as I can. Some of them take a little bit of research, especially since we lost that hard drive that had a whole lot of data on it. Some of the data that I remember, I'm having to remember what I remember and finding some of that stuff. And some of the stuff that I wanted to share in this video, I didn't find until today that'll become relevant as we look at these systems. Now that we have our marching orders, we need to identify, you want to build a system. We're looking at possibly today, because, again, the time frame could change. We're looking in 6 months, which I think is perfect. And based on the information I'm going to share with you, everything's relevant. And then the possibility of even doing a machine in a year. But any one of those time frames you pick, you need to look at the data, go through the data again, and see if everything still lines up. Because if we change one thing, it could change everything. Now, let's start at the source. I like your idea of looking at a motherboard. I think that's great. Sometimes people like to look at a CPU, AMD versus Intel. I've done my research and homework to see what Intel has to offer. And the best thing Intel had, I didn't care for what I saw on the Xeon. We don't get the lanes, we don't get the slots, we don't get enough M.2 drives. And if we back off of the Xeon and look more, even for the chipsets, if we look more toward like an i9, again, we got the same problem. We don't get enough PCI slots because we don't have enough PCI Express lanes to do the magic that you've outlined, which is pretty easy to figure out. And I've got some options, because one is building this machine as you need to use it in the 3 time frames I'm going to share. But number 2 is the possibility, if you do any upgrades, to consider that, because this is always about possibility thinking. So I'm going to try to keep this as tight as I can to share with you the data. But there's going to be some things that I'm going to say, take a look at this, and I'll come back to it. And one of those that I've got to tell you about right now is I've been watching ever since, if you'll remember, when the Lenovo thing came up about the Threadripper Pro 5000 CPUs, and they were going to get them first, and we've been waiting and holding our breath. Well, that initial press release from AMD and that talk from AMD about the Threadripper Pro 5000 was like, okay, put up or shut up. So finally, on May the 1st, because I've been watching Lenovo every day, it's the easiest place to see all the CPUs in the 3000 series Threadripper Pro and in the 5000 series Threadripper Pro. And I noticed on the 1st, they're finally getting the 5000 series processors listed for sale. Not all of them, not the top 2, but I'll say the bottom 3 because there's supposed to be, I believe, is it 5? We'll go through and check that. But the reason I want to tell you about it now is I didn't do the phone call, but I did a chat conversation with sales to find out 2 things from Lenovo. Number 1, when were they going to have those other 5000 series processors? All she could tell me was, all we know is what we have, and any information that comes into the system, we find out 1 week in advance. She said, I don't know the answer to that question, but she said, if you want, I'll keep your email address, and when we find that information out, I'll let you know. I said, that's great. Question number 2, what about Thunderbolt 3 support? Because we're going to be looking at 3 computers on the WRX80 that support Thunderbolt 3. Some of you may know about it, some of you may not. Not all those motherboards are available. I'll get to it, but I want to go through all of them because there's 7 motherboards we need to talk about. And some of it's going to be based on if you build right now, if you build in 6 months, and if you build in a year from now. Because of those 3 motherboards, not all 3 being available, I expect, I hope, that we'll see more options in a year than we see right now. But if you're looking at building in 6 months, you need to buy a motherboard right now because they're getting scarce as hen's teeth. Let's go to the source. I always like to start with AMD on the WRX80. Now, they're going to show us 3 motherboards. And there are actually 7 motherboards that we know of, and I'm going to outline them, and I'll have links in the description for what we know. Now, first, I want to start with the source, which is the chipset, and I kind of find it fascinating that AMD is not keeping this information current and up to date. Starting with these 3 motherboards, let's go through and outline the 7 motherboards we have, the 7 motherboards that we know about that we theoretically are going to have access to eventually. I think that's the best way to put that. And the number 1 motherboard that's probably the easiest to find is the ASUS. But it doesn't meet our requirements, but it's still a WRX80 motherboard. So the ASUS is number 1. Number 2 would be Gigabyte. And actually, number 2 and number 3 would be Gigabyte. Gigabyte has one board, this board listed, that does have Thunderbolt 3 on it. But that motherboard is getting hard to find. And that's probably the motherboard we're going to recommend. Number 3 is the Supermicro. I like that board. Now, Supermicro, we're up to 1, 2, 3, that's 4, offers their motherboard in 3 configurations. 1, the motherboard by itself. 2, the motherboard with a processor already mounted, which solves a whole lot of problems for a lot of people that are having difficulty understanding what's wrong with my PCIe slots, and I have to talk about, is that torqued down correctly for the processor? And number 2, what's wrong with my RAM? Well, do you have bent pins, or, again, is the processor, to reiterate, torqued down correctly? It's the same thing on this WRX40 Designaire. There have been issues with motherboards. You can have issues with a new motherboard just as well as a used motherboard, but I wouldn't buy a used motherboard. It's because if there is a problem about a return, but not just a return, but getting a replacement, that's my concern. So 1 from ASUS, 2 from Gigabyte. 1 Gigabyte has Thunderbolt 3, and we're only looking at Thunderbolt 3 because if we're looking at an audio interface, such as you are, Thunderbolt 3, keep it simple. And then, of course, 1, 2, 3, number 4, the Supermicro, that can be had 3 ways. And right now, I have not been able to find the Supermicro motherboard by itself or with the processor, which was plentiful, but you can still find it at a system built up. So this becomes a question of build or buy as we get more into this, which may be affected by the timeline. But I want to share that with you because we need to know our options. Now, this is another motherboard that we've talked about, the ASRock rack. This is the WRX80 D8-2T. Over here on the right side, if you'll notice, this still says that this motherboard is preliminary, meaning it hadn't been designed yet. But the fascinating part about this is one of 3 motherboards that's going to have Thunderbolt 3 on it, according to that. That motherboard's not available today. In 6 months, who knows? Because it's preliminary, it's probably not going to be available for about a year. That's my guess looking in the crystal ball forecast. It is an option that I would like to see that motherboard and I'd like to build on that motherboard, but it's down the road. So of the three options, Gigabyte's still number one. This would be number three. We got a number two to look at. Now, for those that haven't been keeping up with this, on the Threadripper Pro WRX80 motherboard, the motherboards we're showing and outlining, another motherboard that I check this every day as well, MSI WS WRX80. They're supposed to have a workstation motherboard. That announcement was made and picked up by a lot of sources, but there's still no original information on MSI's website about a WRX80 motherboard. So we can look at it and we can glean what they tell us, but we don't know anything about that motherboard in terms of PCI Express resource allocations. Does it support Thunderbolt? We don't know. Have no idea. So it is an option that we need to keep an eye out on, but I'm glad they're joining in the game. So that's another source that we can keep up with later, and I'll put a link up to it. You can go do a search for it, because any link I have is going to be information based on, number one, when the Threadripper Pro 5000 series CPU was announced. Right after that, MSI had this information that was put out, but to reiterate, it's not on their website yet. Once it's on their website, then we got some real product. So I look at it kind of like the ASRock Preliminary. This may be further out, but then again, it may become available in a year based on when I expect we're going to have access to the 5000 series processor. The earliest I expect the rest of us, will have access to the 5000 series processor could be in 6 months based on what's going on with Lenovo, and I'll get to it. And here's a link on Tom's Hardware about the MSI WS for Workstation WRX80 motherboard. I'm excited to know more about it, but until we get some facts, all we can do is read and look at a picture. And I can't make out whether there's Thunderbolt on that board or not. I haven't seen anything written about it. Now, while we're talking about Tom's Hardware, this was released today, which is 5/3/2022. And this is about the Threadripper Pro 5000 WX CPU available from Lenovo. To reiterate, I saw it on the 1st. We're now doing this video, but I wanted to share this with you. We'll have the link up in the description. I look at that as we're counting the clock if we're on the 6-month time frame from Lenovo having it to the rest of us having it, but they don't have all the processors. We're going to get to it. What's significant about Lenovo? Of the 3 motherboards, and I count Lenovo as a motherboard, this is the 3rd motherboard that's supposed to have Thunderbolt support. And how that's working right now is a bit of a conundrum. I'll show you what I mean. I have a link I'll share with you. I'm not going to get real into this, just that with this there are, as you read this, 2 users. Both want Thunderbolt 3 support. Neither one has Thunderbolt 3 support by the BIOS. One got it working, one does not have it working. And apparently the one that got it working was by using, like we have in this machine, the Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 revision 2. He downgraded the firmware to get that to work, and he jumped pins 3 to 5. Now, pins 3 to 5 are on the Thunderbolt header that's on the Thunderbolt card, not on the motherboard, on the card, to keep the card alive. Some have asked about Alpine Ridge. Well, trying to keep the Alpine Ridge card alive, it's a different animal. And I've seen some systems listed that say they have a TRX40 with an Alpine card. I don't know how they do that. The audio machine that I mentioned in the last video is the one I have reference to. I'm not going to get into it again because we're working with as many lanes as we can get. It's got to be a WRX80 for M.2 NVMe drives for virtual instruments, and I get what that takes. Those need to snap. So that's document number 1. Document number 2, I'm going to give you some information that says Thunderbolt 3 is working on the Lenovo ThinkStation P620, and that's fascinating. And I always say searching for information never follows a straight line. And the information trying to figure out what's going on with the Lenovo ThinkStation P620 is a good example. I've been looking, trying to figure out, and I've got a 3rd document I'll share with you about BIOS. And I've said this before, I'll say it again, we need full documentation on these BIOS updates. A lot of people have the perception that a BIOS update is cumulative. Well, I'm going to show you a 3rd document here in a minute that shows they're not. Vendors don't actually say that. They are sequential. However, based on what I'm able to read from what Lenovo says, they have 3 different groups of BIOS updates for the P620. And to be from one group to another group, you have to be in one group to get to one group before you can go to the 3rd group, which means if there's 3 BIOS updates in that group, any one of those 3 will get you to the next one. So there is some sequential updates going on, but there's still some consecutive updates going on. I'll get to it, but I wanted to show you this that deals with the driver and look at the date of the driver about Thunderbolt 3 on that machine. Intel Thunderbolt driver for Windows 10 for the ThinkStation P620. We have a version, and there's a document here, a README, that'll give us the version of the driver and the control panel, but it doesn't tell us much of anything else. And the date we're looking at, January the 28th of 2022. So anything with January. So if we see a BIOS update for February, I would think that would mean that that would include Thunderbolt support. Guilt by association. But I wanted to point that out because I saw that same analogy when we were working through all the videos we've done about Thunderbolt to get Thunderbolt working with the Gigabyte WRX80 Designaire that has on this machine Thunderbolt 3 with the Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 card. This is revision 1. We've also talked about the revision 2, and we've talked about we're using 4 PCI Express lanes, but we're in an 8-lane slot, so we lose 4 lanes. And on the WRX80 platform, those lanes are precious. That's what I liked about the ASUS board we looked at that had 3 16-lane slots and 1 4-lane slot, but it didn't have Thunderbolt. But it is what it is, so you have to prioritize. Remember those 5 items? Change one thing, changes everything. Okay, right now we know, based on this document, because I asked, and she said, I don't have that information. And I said, how could I find out? And she talked like, from what she said, that would let me know about that. I need to talk to somebody in technical support, but the first question technical support's going to ask, give me the model number and specifications and the serial number on your computer, which I don't have, and then we'll go around in that circle. I've been through that with Gigabyte. So, and I even tried to figure out, well, I could almost do a video about the ThinkStation P620, and I'm of a mind almost to try to get my hands on one to see if Thunderbolt 3 works on that or not. I'm curious. I'm not curious enough, but I'm curious enough to consider the option. So we're looking at 3 options. 1 Gigabyte, 2 ASRock, number 3 Lenovo. But I'm not 100% sure this works. I know what I read, but I also know what I've read about users and the problems they've had. A lot of people want Thunderbolt 3 support. Let me show you the third document. Now this is document for the flash BIOS update for the ThinkStation P620. And if you'll notice here the date, we're looking at February 22nd of 2022. Based on that time frame, January the 28th, February the 22nd. One would think that this BIOS information would have something that says Thunderbolt support, but there's nowhere any of that in here. All it gives is a version. This is 507 KT45A. And looking at the groupings right here, middle BIOS. So there are 3 groups of BIOS updates for this system. Here's an SO7 KT24A, 25A, and a 26A. If your version of BIOS is lower than a 24A and you want to upgrade to the KT45A, you must upgrade to one of the middle BIOS versions first, then upgrade to the latest. So that's where I get that information about how they're doing their updates. But there's nothing conclusive there that says that it's got Thunderbolt support. My expectation it does. I'm going to show you another document that lists items and parts for the P620 on how it's laid out, and they list Thunderbolt as one of those items. And yes, we'll have all these links up. Now, if we do a search on this just for the word Thunderbolt, this takes us down to PCI Express adapters. I'll zoom in on that just a bit. PCI Express adapters, Thunderbolt, rear Thunderbolt, PCI Express adapter. Doesn't give us a part number or a model number. It just says, yeah, there's an adapter for it. So we have to look at what are the requirements for Thunderbolt. Well, you've got to have a header on the motherboard to support it. That gets you BIOS support, and that ties the card to the motherboard for the BIOS so that you can then go into the BIOS and set those apertures for memory allocations so that devices, when they connect, they'll stay connected. Otherwise, they might disconnect and reconnect, and you're not able to do, because when we're doing audio, we not only need that to happen fast, but it's got to be rock solid. So we have 3 options: Gigabyte, Lenovo, and ASRock for Thunderbolt 3 on the WRX80. Okay, in some point in some time frame, let me give you some more information now about the 5000 series processors. I would expect if you want to build right now, you're going to have Thunderbolt 3 on the Lenovo. So the question of build or buy, if you buy this machine, this should work, but we need to verify that, which I have not. I've shown you what I know, and like my cousin Ronnie the Mountain Man says, I know what I know, but what I don't know, I don't know. And I don't know 100% if this works, but I've shared with you what I do know, that it should work. So let's look at the 5000 series processor and you'll see what's available. Now I know we've all been chomping at the bits, and this is a link that I'm going to keep up probably in several of the videos, so it'll be easy for you guys when I reference this to go take a quick look at it. But if you want to find out what's going on, what we have to do here is where it says see more in any one of these. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on the see more. I'll go over here to one of these higher end machines. Now if I zoom in on these and zoom out, the text gets messed up. So we're going to have to look at this as it is from this resolution. You'll notice this is a 5945, a 5945, and there's the 3945 and a 3945. And of course the 3945, the only way to get that particular processor is strictly from Lenovo. I'm not advancing or suggesting anyone do that because there's more to this than meets the eye, but we're still doing research. So I want to show you how far those go, and let's look at how many there are supposed to be available eventually. In fact, we'll take a look at that right quick. The AMD Threadripper Pro model specifications. I'll zoom in on this so we can see a little bit easier. This redraws pretty good when I zoom out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to have 12, 16, 24, 32, and 64 cores. Now my suggestion for most users is probably going to be the 5975 for the best bang for the buck with 32 cores. But for this machine that you're talking about, we're looking at 24 cores, and we might even be looking at 16 cores based on the formula for a 5955. And if we look over here and we look at our 4.5 gigahertz for the maximum boost clock, based on where you're at and what you're trying to do, the base clock at 4 gigahertz, I think you'd be good at 16 cores. So for this build, for your formula, we're talking 64 gigs of RAM, 16 times 4, 64. So I think 16 cores would be great for what you want to do. You've got a good formula for your audio, but you've got a decent formula for your video. Now, if this were all video, I would say more CPU cores, because when you're doing audio, it's single core. There's nothing you can do to speed any of that up. But when you're doing video, multi-cores, you want to speed that up. But really, video is more not just about the CPU, depending on the application, but the ones we're talking about for rendering are all about the GPU, because based on what you're going to use, to reiterate, I've seen that program, Vegas Pro, go from 10% to 80% with GPU rendering. So that's all about the GPU. Either one of those, let's go back and see what we can find based on what's available right now versus 6 months from now, based on the core count. So 5945, and the 5945 is 12 cores based on these other machines. And again, we'll have to do the see more. They have the 5955 and they have a 5965, and that's as far as they go. That's what I wanted to double check. Still the same. So the 5965 will get you 24 cores, and the 5955 will get you 16 cores. If you're looking at building a machine right now, to build it or to buy it, you're going to buy it with a 3000 processor. If you wait in 6 months, which is the time frame you're looking at, you should be able to get your hands on one of these processors that Lenovo has right now, the 5000 series. In a year from now, then I expect the other processors, the faster processors, will be available. However, for your time frame based on 6 months, I think you're in a good spot for either one of those. Now, the next thing we need to look at and consider, I want to go back to Gigabyte, because if you were to buy, you're looking at Lenovo. Thunderbolt 3 support, I think it's there, but we need to verify it. If you're going to build it, then we're talking about Gigabyte, which is one of my favorites, which is why we did this. Again, prioritization is those 5 items. The problem right now with Gigabyte is that motherboard is scarce as hen's teeth. So if you're looking to build, I have no idea, looking in crystal ball, what's going to happen, because a year ago I told people not to buy the motherboard until you can get the GPU, because I didn't see the CPU as being a problem. Now the CPU is a problem, so I say get the motherboard. You may have to sit on it, which affects the warranty because it's going to be sitting. Something to think about. So let's go see what we can find based on what we're looking at for Thunderbolt 4 Gigabyte. And the easiest way to find this is probably going to go to Newegg. I can put a link up into Amazon, but I don't think you'll be happy with what you find right now. Now that may change. I don't know that for a fact. We're going to look at this 2 ways. You'll be amazed at the information that pops up. If we look at this in terms of a WRX80, we've got ASUS, we've got Gigabyte, and there are a couple of ways to get that WRX80 motherboard from Gigabyte with Thunderbolt 3. One, the motherboard by itself. Number two, the motherboard with a processor. And if I take you to a link, which I'll put up in the description, but I won't get into here, over to Amazon, the only thing that Amazon is showing for the Gigabyte WRX80 motherboard is buying a used motherboard, which I've already said my piece on that. I say used. It looks like it's probably a return motherboard, which may be missing some parts, which could be missing the Thunderbolt card. That's not the deal killer. The deal killer is, are there any bent pins for the memory or the CPU? Because then it's the issue of, okay, getting a replacement. So I'll have the link up, but I'm hoping they're going to have some more boards up. Now, I can contact Gigabyte. I can call them. That's the only way I can get in touch with them. I was in hopes to try to get in touch with Gigabyte through Amazon, because sometimes they answer some of the questions, but I haven't been able to find where they've answered a question where I can say, hey, I would get better feedback. I've had that with other manufacturers. So right now, your best option is, if you buy that motherboard, you're going to have to pay too much for it. The question is it worth it? For what you want, I think it is. And I can't believe I'm saying that. But that's our best option for a motherboard for now, unless you buy one already made, which you're talking about Lenovo. Now, what's the downside with Lenovo? There's another little feature that AMD has called vendor lock that AMD has made available, but only Lenovo is using. What is that? Okay, you buy a Lenovo computer. It's got a processor in it. We're talking about the ThinkStation P620 Threadripper Pro. You buy whatever processor you want to put in there, it's got vendor lock. What does that mean? That means that CPU is locked to that brand of motherboard. If you pull that CPU out and upgrade it, no sweat. But if you pull that CPU out to upgrade it, and then you want to sell that processor, you can only sell it to somebody that has a Lenovo, and that's the problem. That's the conundrum. So I think it's going to really hurt the secondary market, because say you put in 24 cores. That's decent. Say somebody else wants to build and they want a 24-core processor. Well, they're only going to be able to use that processor if they have a Lenovo, and it's not like you buy a Lenovo motherboard. You buy a Lenovo ready built. 3 motherboards with Thunderbolt. One is ASRock, Preliminary. We don't know what's up with MSI yet. Number 2 is the Lenovo, which I'm talking about. And then, of course, number 3 is the Gigabyte, which was the original Thunderbolt 3 motherboard. And it's getting hard to find. Everybody's out of stock. So that's about a $700 motherboard. You're paying a premium. I would get one. In fact, depending on the nature of the beast, you might want to buy 2, because this is serious stuff. And I'm going to say that and venture this out. Used to in the past, for the last, 20, 25 years, whenever I built a primary machine, I always had a backup machine. I quit building backup machines when we started building the Threadripper, and then when we did the 3rd generation Threadripper, I built a backup machine. But now that we've built this TRX40, I built one machine. However, based on what's going on with the WRX80, with the 3000 and the 5000 processor, I'd like to get my hands on several different motherboards and look at the BIOS and how those are allocated, what they look like. Some of the features we'll never touch, but I'd still like to look through them and see how they're managed, how they're set up, because every BIOS is different. And I can give you some specs. For example, in the past, been doing this for quite a while, if you were going to build Intel, you wanted an ASUS motherboard. If you were going to build AMD, then you wanted a Gigabyte motherboard. Now, if you're going to build a server, you wanted a Super Micro motherboard. Those have been the historical facts for a very long time. But I always like to look and see what our options are, because we've built with a lot of different motherboards. Tyan used to have a desktop motherboard. Super Micro used to have a desktop motherboard. We've built with all of them, and I have my favorites for different reasons, but for the most part, the ones that work the best with the longevity for what we try to do, that give us the least amount of hassle. Keep it simple, make it work. So we've got more. My greatest concern with buying a motherboard from Newegg is you're not buying it directly from Newegg, you're only buying it on Newegg's platform. Because if you look here in the fine print, now here's a good example. This motherboard says ships from the United States. Okay, I'm good with that. My concern, let's go back and look at the other one. That's just a motherboard. This particular setup, and even though we're paying too much for it, it's a motherboard and a processor, and of course it's a $39.95, but it says right here, this motherboard ships from China. I'm a little concerned about letting that kind of money go to somebody that I have no way to because the worst case scenario that we would have actionable access to would be if they don't deliver, we complain to Newegg, and the Newegg cuts them off the platform. Same thing you have on Amazon. If a vendor doesn't deliver, well, I'd want to research that vendor before I did that, before I went down that road. So the problem we're having with getting processors and the problem we're having with getting motherboards, if you needed an ASUS motherboard, there's plenty of them. 30 days ago, there was plenty of Supermicro motherboards. It's a very fluid situation. It's changing. So to reiterate, you need this motherboard of the three possibilities. And if you're going to build, I'd get the one in the US. Problem is you're going to have getting a CPU. So if you wait 6 months, I think you'll be able to get the processor you want, but you got to be ready when they're available. Because right now, only Lenovo has them. And Lenovo does not have the higher end processor, but that's not what you need. Okay, if we've addressed the RAM, which you've identified, which I agree with, we've addressed the motherboard based on Thunderbolt 3, based on the formula for the video, and we've addressed Thunderbolt, which will work because Thunderbolt 3 is what you're after. Then we need to address the GPU, and you've got a 3070 spec, and based on CPU core count and video RAM, my suggestion, I don't think the 3070 is going to give you what you need for what you want to do, so I'm going to suggest something different. Let's take a quick look at the RTX 3070 specs from GeForce, the full specs, and what I want us to look at, it's got 8 gigs of video RAM. Now, based on the CPU core count, 8 cores, 8 gigs, no. 12 cores, 12 gigs of VRAM, 16 cores, 16 gigs of VRAM, 24 cores, 24 gigs of VRAM. That's my point. So, and the GPU is going to do 80% of the rendering. So, I think you're selling yourself short if you go with that particular GPU based on the formula. I'll show you something that I think might be an option, a better option. Let's take a look at the RTX A4000. If you're looking at 16 cores, then I would say a 16 gig GPU, and it needs to be NVIDIA. However, it doesn't have to be NVIDIA. You could also use an AMD Radeon Pro that will have the RAM on it. It'll be less expensive than the NVIDIA. But because of CUDA cores, I would stick with the NVIDIA. I think that's where you're better off. Because I've got another option I want to mention that I think because of the drivers may keep things a little bit simpler. And I'm going to go through some of the slots as we go back to the Gigabyte board because we got more here to cover. It's, change one thing changes everything. So what would we do if we're looking at, say, 24 gigs? Let's find out. The RTX A5000, and that will give you 24 gigs. So my point on that, for a lot of reasons, and I'll go over ahead and show you this motherboard in a second, but for design choices to have a balanced machine for a purpose-built machine, you don't need this kind of a GPU for doing audio, but you do need this kind of a GPU for doing video. So for the balanced machine, I would suggest size it accordingly. Here's your CPU cores. If you're going with 16 cores, then get 16 gig video RAM. If you're going to go with 24 CPU cores, then get 24 gig video RAM. And of course, the other option is the AMD. I'm going to mention it because if I don't, somebody else will. I use and have been using for quite some time the AMD Radeon Pro. In fact, the machine I do most of the rendering on from this video you're going to see is on a Radeon Pro 9100. Now, the reason I want to mention that is because at the time I thought this is nuts putting that kind of card in a machine because I don't need that much power. At the time, Vegas Pro was only doing 10% rendering at the time. But now it does 80%, and I've been using that GPU that time, and when the program upgraded and got to 80%, I looked at it on a fluke. As long as it's going through just video, it's flying. But it slows down to a crawl when it hits the overlays. And I like the 80%. Big difference from 10%. The reason I'm telling you this is the formula is just a starting point. Do at least that or better. The other reason, let me go overhead. As we look at the spacing on slots, because I have two 16-lane slots and I have two 8-lane slots. This is a 16-lane slot here. There's an 8-lane slot right down there that you can't see that's just tucked under the edge because this particular GPU, which is an RTX 3080, is too wide. It's like 2.5 slots wide or 2 1/4. The point of it is the GPU based on slot width, because that's a 16 slot right there, I lose access to that 8-lane slot, so I only have two 16-lane slots based on the width of the GPU. Your GPU needs to stay at 2 slots wide. When you build a workstation like we're talking about, slot width matters. On a high-end desktop, we had some variance, and on the high-end desktop, that's when we learned, as some said, is that a design anomaly or a design problem. It was a design choice that we didn't know about that was going on, and it was a gotcha we found out after the fact when we went from high-end desktop, the WRX80 came out, and we saw that 2 slot width spacing. If you're going to build a workstation, get a workstation card so you can maintain that 2 slot. Now, another subscriber has talked about that they're looking at a 3080, kind of like this, and they're looking at doing a liquid cooler on that machine so that they can keep that at 2 slots wide, which I think is fantastic. Alpha Cool, I think, is the one that does it. Now that I mentioned it, I'll get a link up to it. But it was either 3080 or 3090. Let me look. Well, the link I wanted to show you, I don't have access to right now, but yes, it is Alpha Cool. I'll find the link. I'll get it up in the description. What stuck in my mind was to do what Alpha Cool is doing to make that work in the width and spacing they've got. They've made it thinner. And they talked about using 1mm pads to make all that work and how it's going to cover everything. So I'm excited about that, to be able to use a consumer GPU like that. However, even if we get that issue, you still got power to deal with. But even if we get it down to 2 slots wide, we don't have enough GPU video RAM, enough VRAM in there. So that's why I'm saying and advocating an RTX A series, RTX A4000 based on CPU core count, or an RTX A5000. Let's go back now and take a look at the Gigabyte motherboard. Now, the Gigabyte WRX80, and I must not always look at all of them the same, because each one of these is different, and that's what we're going through. I'm going to go to support. I'm curious about the BIOS. We need to point this out right quick. For issues of specifically being sequential or cumulative, there is another technology that has been enabled with some of the BIOS updates that do not allow you to backdate the BIOS. And that's, I think, going to be a significant problem going forward. As I look at these 3 BIOS updates, I don't see that. Curious solved a slot 4 PCI Express 4x4x4x4, which is bifurcation mode for the NVMe. Curious. Add support for the RAID function in the BIOS. They didn't have it. That's interesting too, because now I have a better understanding of some other people that are having problems. They couldn't do RAID. And this is irrelevant going forward with this machine as we look at upgrades. You want to put a copious amounts of M.2 NVMe drives in here. Okay, let's download the manual, look at the resources based on the motherboard layout, and I want to describe some things and talk about how some of that plays out. And I may come back and touch on this BIOS issue, but that is most fascinating. So we need to go to the support manual. Oh, another thing we'll look at right quick. Let's check this out. Let's look at the support list and the CPU support list. No, it's not going to be updated. CPU support list shows January the 22nd of 2021. What I was looking at, and we'll go ahead and check the list just to verify, but based on the date, that's going to be the 3000 series processor. This is something else I've been watching like flies on honey. I'm looking for a BIOS update to get us 5000 series processor support, which means when we see a BIOS update for that, processors are going to be available, and we're probably looking at 30 days out. So we're going to all be like sitting on ready. But let's download this and double check. I don't think it is based on date, but take nothing for granted. So we'll pull down CPU support list. Now, just as we expected, these are all 3000 series processors, of which there's 4. And again, a 3945 can only be had from Lenovo, so it's kind of strange it's in the list, but it's there. Anyway, 3945, 3955, 3975, which is the one I would recommend to most people, and then of course the 3995. And AMD is going to have, at some point, 5 processors on the 5000 series. And if you were building today, you would be looking at probably a 3955, which would get you 16 cores. But if you wait, then you'd be able to go from 16 cores to 24 cores. And I think there's going to be probably a lot of people looking at that. But if you can see how it affects the frequency, a base clock from 4 gigahertz to 3.8. Based on audio, 16 cores. Based on video, 24 cores. Okay, now that we've verified the BIOS update, I'm going to go back, and I would also do your RAM according to the QVL, but this is a workstation. I would put ECC on here. Okay, one manual, English. Let's download that. And the way these motherboards are set up is a different animal. We've got product specifications, voila, a motherboard block diagram. I've been missing that on a lot of the motherboards we've been looking at, so we may take a look at that just for a gander. What I want to look at first of all is we'll start at the top with the motherboard layout, and this is on page 5. Now the orientation of the board's a little funky. What we're looking at the top would normally be the north end, and that should be rotated to the left. So keep that in mind as we're looking at these slots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 slots. We'll go back and check the specifications in a minute. The Thunderbolt connector should be on the bottom edge being the edge on the left, or it could be on the bottom, which would be the right. There it is, number 14. So let's go look at number 14. No, that's PM bus. Number 30. Thunderbolt header is number 30. So I'm looking on the motherboard based on the specs, and I didn't see it. So back to the motherboard layout. I see 31. I see 34 and 32. Ah, there it is. Well, that doesn't look like the normal. I found it. Sorry to be so slow. Right there, number 30. So that is on the bottom edge. Normally those are keyed with a notch on it. It doesn't show that. And the one that looked like was going to be it was that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 pins. That's number 14. And the one we're looking at is number 30, which is on the bottom edge of the motherboard. Right there. And that is right next to number 7, which should be, that looks like a 19-pin connector for USB 3 to the front of the motherboard. Or excuse me, from the motherboard to the front of the case. Let's go back to specifications. That says page 9. Okay, here's the slot layout. PCI Express by 16. All by 16 mechanically. Electrically, there's slot number 2, and the slots are numbered from the bottom up. We're used to seeing them from the top down. My expectation based on experience, that 8-lane slot, which means we're going to lose 4, is where we'd put Thunderbolt 3. And that would have it fairly close to that connector. So it would be the second from the bottom, which is curious. I'm also curious if they have solved the bus prioritization issue that we encountered on this machine, where we had a space relation issue on where the GPU and Thunderbolt 3 could sit. Previously, when this thing first shipped, they had to be right next to each other. If you separated them, fine. If you put anything in between them, system wouldn't boot. And that was really a weird conundrum sorting that out. But with firmware updates, which turned out to be the firmware update to the Thunderbolt card, solved the problem. I thought it was an issue with the BIOS, but it was firmware on the Thunderbolt card. That was weird. But anyway, we solved it. So I'm curious if they'll have it there. Hopefully they don't. Another thing I'd like to know is if they have hot swap, but that's just me and I digress. As it relates to you building your machine, this is the motherboard you want to get that's available right now. If you build or if you buy. Now, based on slot width, as we look again at the specifications, those are about 2 slots wide. So you'll be able to get everything you want as long as you maintain 2 slots wide. Okay, 1, we're addressing building the machine. 2, we've addressed the hardware, Thunderbolt 3, and where that needs to sit. Now, another option I want to mention to you, when you put in all these quad cards, because even though you've got, let's do a count again, we have 7 slots, we're talking 6. If we have a GPU, that's 1, and then another GPU, which I'll get to in a minute, that leaves 4. So you have the potential of putting in 4 quad cards. 4 quad cards with 4 M.2 NVMe drives on each card. That's a lot of storage, that's a lot of space, that's a lot of drives. Now, my suggestion would be those 4 cards that you can install and add as you want. The other issue we need to talk about is RAID. RAID can be done one of 3 ways historically. I'm going to mention a 4th that is applicable to this machine. And we've done a lot of videos on this, how to do the AMD RAID, bifurcation and all that. There's a software RAID, which is done in the operating system. Then there's a hybrid BIOS RAID, which is a bootable RAID, which you do from the BIOS. And we've just seen about a BIOS update that addresses that issue, which is kind of wild. Version number 3, that should have been from version number 1. Anyway, the point of that, even if you do a hardware RAID card, all 3 of those are CPU-based RAID. Because of what you're doing for this machine to focus and concentrate on digital audio for a workstation and also for video rendering, I would take that process and remove it from the CPU so the CPU does the 2 things you wanted. You don't want the CPU doing thing number 3, which is managing the RAID. So this would be a good candidate for a GPU-based RAID, which is G-RAID. We've talked about, we did a video on. I'll put a link up in the description. I'm not going to get into it here, but the GPU, which is an NVIDIA GPU, the reason to stick with NVIDIA, will manage that RAID and offload that process so the CPU can do the other stuff. So we've addressed more than you asked, but we've addressed everything you asked and then some. Now, if you're going to set these cards up, and again, you want to do them one at a time, and if you're going to do them in RAID, then you want to immediately jump and get one of those G-RAID cards. I'll have a link up in the description. So everything about this machine I think is really, really cool, and I hope we've addressed all those issues. I've got more research that I could share with you, but based on the time and what it's taken to do this, I don't want to waste anybody else's time. So build it, buy it. 3 options, 2 are realistic. If we do it now, if we do it in 6 months, we still need to revisit the issue, or if you do it in a year. But this is what I know based on the requirements you gave me for what you asked, and I think this will be a really, really cool machine. I'm stoked to see you build it. I want to thank you for asking. This is BuildOrBuy. My name is Gil Boyd. Thanks for joining us. We're going to look forward to seeing you next video. And remember, coming up in this next one, we're going to talk about the X299 chipset, which is Intel. That was a phenomenal chipset at the time, but we've got somebody else that wants to do virtual instruments. And I wanted to address the issue about PCI Express 5, but suffice to say, I'm going to repeat what I've said, and that's all I'm going to say. We're going to jump over it. PCI Express 5 should be 2 years. The only people that will benefit, I think, from PCI Express 5 of the 3 things that can be delivered. Number 1, an M.2 NVMe drive. Number 2, the PCI Express bus, which number 3 would be about the GPU. Okay, speed of PCI Express 5 in a computer is no longer about the GPU, and it hadn't been since PCI Express 3. It's all about the M.2 NVMe. Virtual instruments are the one thing that need to load fast that will benefit from that. However, you're only going to be able to put in 1 drive based on the implementation we've seen. For those that want to talk about the Alder Lake X, up for conjecture, because none of that is real yet. It's all, if they come and deliver on the high-end desktop like they need to, I'll mention some of that in the next video. So thank you for watching. Best place to be. Build this. I think you'll have a 6-year machine. And this gets us over to PCI Express 6, which is said to be, if things follow true, a long-term platform. See you next video. Thanks for watching. We're out.